So I have here with me Luke. He's our CEO at Puppet Labs, and this is kind of an open Q&A. We can ask anything we want. I've got a couple of canned questions that I'll kick it off with those. But honestly, it's gonna be more fun if you guys ask questions because I'm in space. It's my boss. Really, how hard am I gonna be on him? So my questions are gonna be, nice, getting started questions, and then the rest of the questions have to come from you guys. So think about it. We also have some prizes. I'll talk about that in a minute.
And only one rule in the questions, easy questions only. Can't ask me anything hard. It's Friday night. I've been traveling all week, so I'm kidding about that. But
you have to wait till he has the beer for the hard questions. All right, so I'll kick it off. So Puppet Labs has been growing a lot over the past year. What are your plans for Puppet Labs in 2013? And then what are your personal priorities as the CEO of the company?
Yeah, so 3.5 years ago, we were 3 people, and now we're about 110. So there has been quite a bit of growth. We moved into our new offices, our old new offices about 2 years ago. We were 25, I think, when we moved in there. When we changed to our current offices in December, we were about 105. So, fourfold increase in 2 years there. I think this year we're expecting to be about 200 people at the end of the year. So still looking at very strong growth in the company. And what we're focused on this year is, I think, two basic things. One is release management overall. So building, for most of our products, we're focusing on, whatever we can do to make the process of getting change from the developers or sysadmins keyboard into production. And a lot of that is, incremental releases, incremental product releases we can build that'll make it easier to do those things. And then the second one is we hear from customer after customer. So I've been flying over, I was in New York the first part of the week, and then I've been in San Francisco since Wednesday night at 1 a.m. And almost every customer I talk to, they're very interested in how to manage orchestration across large numbers of hosts. How do I deploy a multi-host application and things like that? So that's another thing we'll be spending a lot of time on this year. In terms of the long term, we think that there's a real opportunity in the market to build a great independent company. You look at the incumbents in the management space right now, and they're not able to build products that can really meet the demands of modern infrastructure, whether you're talking about virtualization and cloud, or just managing lots and lots of different varieties of applications, or managing network, storage, database, and systems all at the same time. So our long-term target is to be that strong independent company that does that. In terms of my personal priorities, I don't break down, I guess. I don't know. I've got 5-year-old twins at home, or 4-year-old twins at home right now, and it's about basically staying ahead of the wave, surfing the wave and making sure that we are able to grow the way we need to grow, and build and ship product that we need to satisfy the users, and so a lot of it's that.
Cool. So as a company, one of our primary focus areas this year is going to be Puppet Enterprise. So maybe you could share some of our plans for Puppet Enterprise in 2013 and what we're focused on? Yeah,
so I mentioned the release management was going to be a big part of it. And what we've seen again and again when we look at companies who are using Puppet is the most successful companies, the most successful deployments of Puppet almost all include essentially a release management process that was either wholesale copied from the developer world or was heavily influenced by it. A lot of organizations they don't have the experience to build a process like that, or it's a barrier of entry to get something like that set up. And so really our major overwhelming goal in Puppet Enterprise is to build capability that makes it easier for everybody to manage how they release products into their infrastructure, whether it's the Puppet code itself or the applications that you're using Puppet to manage. And so that's we're going to have like change visualization release in the very near future, and then we'll be adding functionality that over time, such that hopefully by the end of the year you'll see direct management applications coming out.
So we also had a question from Nathan Buck on Twitter earlier this week, who asks, what's the plan going forward with developing Puppet for Windows, and is it where it should be, or is more coming?
Yeah, and so I just talked to Josh Cooper at Puppet Labs, who is the person who's been doing most of the Windows support. He's been, for most of the last year, he's been 100% devoted to Windows, or nearly 100%, probably not quite 100, but, and he said that as far as we can tell, we've got, it's where it needs to be. 6 months ago, a year ago, we had companies, or we had individuals saying that, it wasn't quite there. We needed this piece or we needed that piece. But as far as we can tell right now, everybody who wanted something from Windows is, what's left is kind of the icing thing, things that would be nice as opposed to the things that are necessary to use it in production. And I had my first meeting this week with a customer, with a financial customer in New York City, and they were the first company I've talked to who they started with Windows. Their first deployment of Puppet was on Windows, and that was successful enough that they're now looking at going from Windows to their Linux distributions for that. And I know we've had some meetings with companies in Seattle who chose Puppet based on the strength of the Windows support. So I'm pretty confident in our Windows support at this point.
Awesome. So let's open it up for questions. The prize that we have for the first 5 good questions, I'm going to qualify that, good as defined by Dawn. The first 5 people to ask good questions get a Pro Puppet book. So we've got some of those in the back. And again, it's being recorded, so wait for the mics to get your way.
Questions?
Yeah, hi. So there are a lot of so what's your focus on the application domains? There are a lot of things that are happening. Some of them, today we talked about, like, Hadoop is one of them. In the cloud space, a lot of things are happening. So what's Puppet's focus on, dealing with different things that are happening on the cloud and big data and, maybe mobile and whatnot? So I mean, do you have plans to move up, from the infrastructure to the service level / application level and things like that?
Yeah, it's complicated. What we try to do as a company is walk the line between being a generic infrastructure company, but always enabling the specific problems that our customers need to solve, or enabling solutions to the problems. We don't want to enable the problems, I suppose. Cloud is a great example of that, where we don't want to be a cloud company. We don't want to be a company who only does cloud, because if you look at most people's infrastructure, it's still on-premise. It might be virtualization, but it's still mostly on-premise. And so what we try to do is build the core technology as generic as possible and as suitable for any kind of infrastructure as possible. And then our preference beyond that is to build modules. So you look at OpenStack as a good example. We had a big press release last summer on the OpenStack modules that Dan Bodie, who was standing over there recently, largely built to be able to deploy OpenStack in production very quickly and easily. He built those in combination with Red Hat, Rackspace, Cisco, and a couple of other companies. So that's an example of us working well in the cloud, not by building special magical technology, but by adding content, adding content primarily, and then plugins where needed to support OpenStack. Similarly on mobile or network or things like that, those are all, as much as possible, we're trying to rely on first Puppet modules, and if that doesn't work, then plugins, and if that doesn't work, then we modify the core as needed. And so far that has worked pretty well for most things. We've got a lot of customers who are building Hadoop clusters. I was meeting at a customer half an hour ago who built their Hadoop cluster with Puppet, and that's a case where Puppet works really well out of the box to manage big data infrastructure. And we've got a partner in Europe who's using Puppet to manage more than 2,000 Android tablets. Again, that's pretty bone stock Puppet. They didn't have to make any changes to do that. So our focus is really on generic technology that can be used anywhere. And if we have to, we'll really do our best to add plugins or content as opposed to needing to change the core. But then when we need to change the core, we're always going to try to find a way to say, okay, somebody had this new problem. Can the solution to this problem be used in other places? And then make sure that when we go to pick a solution, it's a solution that works everywhere, and not just a solution that works well on Windows or works well on network or something like that. And one of the things we've also, as we've gotten more adoption outside of just systems and just Linux, we had somebody post to the dev list today that they've got patches to support NetApp as a management target for Puppet. And our goal is to get that in the system quickly. So we've seen a lot of success, but what happens is that the concerns of the core system change, and so things that belonged in core a year ago or 2 years ago, because everyone who did systems work used these things, they become a little bit less core. Because if you're running on a network device, are you really going to use something that's really built to manage packages on a Unix system? So some of those things are going to begin moving out of the core and be on the Forge, and that way, if I'm using this on one platform, I don't have a bunch of dead weight that doesn't matter on that platform. And so the overall expectation from the system is going to get a bit more generic too. Well, wait just a second for Kyle.
There you go.
How, two related questions. So how much is the focus on building a programming language versus building modules such as basic building blocks that could be reused? And for that latter part, I mean, I think people have been striving for that, and there's a lot of challenges to it. What do you think the challenges to that are, and what are kind of the steps, like things like versioning and some maybe even standards, I don't know if that's the right solution, that would enable more reuse?
Yeah, so for me, the language needs to stay as small as possible, but no smaller. And I think, so for us, we're always trying to find the right balance in the language between having enough power that people can do what they need to do, but not having a full, complete programming language. The things that I'm concerned about in the programming language are things like accessibility. Can somebody quickly learn it and become relatively productive very quickly? And given a chunk of code in Puppet, how likely is it that an average Puppet user is going to be able to read and understand and make changes to that chunk of code? I was talking to a customer earlier this week, and they had about 180 employees. This is a stock exchange. And of their 180 employees, 30 of them had committed to their Puppet repository. So that's a pretty large percentage of their organization was able to effectively make changes to Puppet. And I think that's a target we always want to strive for. And that probably means it's always going to look a little bit less like a programming language and a little bit more like a configuration language. And if you look at what's necessary to build reusable modules, and thus we're always looking for, what does it take to make the content reusable and the content as powerful as possible. And there are a few things we need to add to the system to make that better than it is today. Some of it, I think, is the infrastructure around the modules. So whether it's the Forge, we've done a ton of work on the Forge this year. And that's made a very big difference in how well it's used, how much it's adopted. And then there's also the packaging support on the modules themselves and things like that. So yeah, there's some work to do there. I think most of that is generally there. The module system is by no means a great package manager at this point, but it is nearly a sufficient package manager. We're doing work on it, but it's pretty close. I think probably the most important things to add in the near term to make modules more reusable is to make it easier as a module developer to build a module that can be used the way you want to use it and the way that other people want to use it too. So right now, if you're building a set of related modules, right now you have to pretty much hardwire them together. You have to couple them in a way that works for you but may not work for somebody else who wants to use one of your modules but not all 10 of them. And so what we need to build is a system that allows you to say, here are the things you can use in this module, and here are the things that you shouldn't use in the module. And this comes up a lot in conversations with really all the development teams. But where I expect that to be solved is by building, and I know you and I have talked about this a good bit in particular, but basically building the ability to have modules declare what services they need and what services they provide, so that when you go to connect two modules together, you're connecting them together a bit more symbolically, rather than saying, this module needs exactly this module. You can say this module needs a database, and this module provides a database, and therefore they're compatible, and they have some sort of, I don't want to say compatibility layer, but they've got a kind of a generic mechanism for describing how they're related and how information passes between them. And that all fits into the orchestration and cross-host management story too, which I think is going to take a little bit longer to do, but I feel like we're pretty close on it.
Next question here. So my question is very general. So within a lot of companies that grow, the innovation generally just slows down. So as you grow, how do you plan to keep up with innovation?
It's a good question, and it's certainly a question that scares me a lot, because I completely agree with you. It's very tough to remain innovative as you grow. It's tough to remain innovative. It's just tough to innovate at all. And so almost everything you do results in less innovation. And to me, the major things that we're trying to do are, first, we're trying to leave as much decision-making as possible with people who aren't at the top. So I want to give the development teams, I want to give the product managers, I want to give the design teams, I want to give our professional services teams as much right and responsibility as possible to make their own decisions. And then I want to not be attached to any one solution we already have. So all the technology we have right now, most of the technology we have right now I like and I think is the right stuff. But in a year, if we haven't begun to replace some things we have with something else, if we haven't begun to kind of lose an emotional attachment to what looks like a good solution today, but tomorrow may be stupid, then you end up calcifying. You end up saying, well, that was the right answer in 2008. It's got to be the right answer today. Probably it's not the right answer today. And I think one of the things we work very hard to do is to always ask our customers, okay, given the solutions you have today, now what's your most important problem? Now what's your most important problem? And I think it's easy in a product company to always find a way for your existing products to solve your customer's next problem. And I think for us, what we're always trying to do is we want to find a way to make sure that a given product was built to solve a given problem, but when you come up with the next problem, it might make our last product kind of uninteresting now, right? And to some extent, I expect that to happen. I'm not saying, hey, some product we have today is going to be abandoned or should be considered boring, but at some point, if we look up in 10 years or in 15 years and Puppet is still the most exciting product we offer, we're failing, right? That can't be the answer. There's got to be something more interesting. There's got to be a technology stack that we have to build. And generally speaking, it's the top of the stack that's most interesting, right? No one talks about the lower parts anymore because they're not the sexy part. They're not the part that is meant to address the most important products your customer has, or most important problems. In general, though, it's just about trying to make sure that ideas can come from anywhere in the organization and make sure that as many people as possible in the company recognize that their job is to build the thing they think is best for their customer and not the thing that best aligns with what we've already got investments in and things like that. I've certainly spent a lot of time looking at how companies like 3M do innovation and how other companies are innovative. And 3M is kind of famous for being innovative, and one of the things they do is business units are compensated differently depending on how old the product is. So if you've got a product that's 10 years old, then you make revenue on that and you get this much compensation. But if you've got a product that's 3 years old, you make revenue, you get this much compensation. We're a bit young to be able to do that, but certainly we try to find the balance between investing in things we already know are good ideas that are already aligned with our current products, and then also investing in things that, let's see how this works. Somebody comes with a good idea and we go, that seems like a good idea. Well, here's a team and let's see what happens. Go prove that that's going to work. And we've got a case like that right now where Carl Kalm, who's one of our, joined us as a professional services consultant and then moved into development, and now he's a product manager building a product that he had built a prototype for, and he spent 6 months kind of lobbying for this prototype, and now he's got a team of people, and his job is to bring that product to market and prove himself right. So that's one example of what we're trying to do there.
Hi, you touched on the growth of the company, and I was kind of curious, what do you think are the top 5 differentiators of Puppet versus some of the other products? Because you're going to be approaching incumbency pretty soon in Silicon Valley, so that means all the disruptors are going to be chewing at your heels. What do you see today as the top 5 or so differentiators from the other products out there that are even close? Because until a couple of years ago, there weren't even products like this.
Yep.
So what do you think differentiates Puppet today? And I know you've touched on where you're going, but what do you think the biggest thing is that makes you the best at what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can count to 5 right now, but we'll start with 3 and see if we have any more after that. So I think one of the things that differentiates us the best right now is, I don't have a great phrase for this, but I've been calling it organizational scalability, the ability for a large number of people in a company to use Puppet. And I touched on this briefly when I was talking about a company in New York that an eighth of their company is using Puppet. We've seen that again and again, and I can't point to one feature and say that's the feature that gives us organizational scalability. But it's an overall focus on simplicity and the ability to analyze any piece of the stack, the model-driven aspects that mean that every part of the system produces data that you can do analysis on that data and figure out, okay, what files am I managing, or what changed, or what version of the catalog is that, or things like that. All that information leads to the system being easier to analyze, and the whole thing is pretty simple in the end. So we've got multiple customers who we've trained tens of people at their company. We've got hundreds of people in some case who are using Puppet successfully on multiple continents in multiple countries. That I think is a feat that really no one else has gotten close to, and it's something that a lot of the new technology tools. I mean, this is the case. A technologist builds an application. Are they building it for themselves, or are they building it for people who aren't like them? And I can't say that we've done it perfectly, but we've always focused hard on building tools for people who don't look exactly like us, but people who look, more like your average sysadmin. For we've got our limits in our ability to figure out what that means, but still that's our goal. Another one is, I think there's a big security difference in what we do versus what a lot of people do. Because every part of the Puppet pipeline, every part of the stage in Puppet produces data and not code. And that data can be passed around by itself. And you can get so far as people, the German air traffic control system, when they compile the catalogs for their hosts, they burn those catalogs to a CD, and they walk that CD over to the machines that are being managed. And that's a level of security that is really challenging to get with anybody else. And of course, the catalog itself is a very small amount of information. It's not my entire set of configurations. It's not a lot of data. It's just the amount of data that individual host needs to configure itself. And there are a lot of different places in the system where you can add control points, you can add visibility points, and you can just have a lot more control and information about what's going on in the system, and that gives you a lot more security. And then, let's see, another piece. This is harder to describe, but I think we're the only company that's really focused on building fundamental technology, that's building something that other people can build on. It's not enough for me to say, Puppet is great, you should use it by itself. I feel like for Puppet to succeed in the long run, there have to be people building things on top of it. You have to be able to point to other companies who are integrating with Puppet all the time, other companies who their products wouldn't work without Puppet. Because that's the definition of an ecosystem in the long run. And this is where, when I was at BladeLogic, you could see there were no companies building things on top of BladeLogic. It's whatever, 8, 10 years old now, and you still can't point to other startups who have relied on BladeLogic technology or OpsWare technology to really make their companies succeed. And yes, they succeeded monetarily, but they didn't succeed at really moving the market around. And with Puppet, I can point to 4 or 5 startups, including Reactor 8, these guys here, who have built things on top of Puppet. They were able to use Puppet to do things. You may have seen Cloudsmith at some of the other companies, some of the other events we've done. And that's an area where, that's people actually starting companies, but then there are a lot of cases of integration where people are relying on parts of Puppet to solve a problem that they now don't have to think about, and they can focus on the core parts of their application. And that, in some ways, that's not as much a differentiator. My customers don't necessarily care as much about that per se when I talk to them, but in terms of what I think will sustain our growth in the long term, I think that's a big part of it. And so you come at, when somebody builds a really interesting application that solves a point problem right now, but it really only works for the highest level sysadmins who are able to spend a lot of time understanding it, and it's not going to integrate with all the existing solutions, then it becomes a lot tougher.
And the one thing I'd add to that is that, a point of differentiation, I think, for us is that we have a really nice, supportive community. I mean, I've been in a lot of open source projects.
True.
And I have never been in a community that was this nice and this helpful to each other. And so it's, it's something that we want to continue to grow. I mean, selfishly, as the community lead, that's the piece that I'm focused on. But I do really think it's a differentiator for Puppet because, if you look at the questions that are being answered on the user mailing lists, on the Ask site, most of them are being answered by other users, not
Mostly
by Puppet
we're
Lab
lazy,
employees. Yeah, because we're lazy. But because, the best support you can get are other people that are going through this at the same time you are. And it's just a really supportive community, and I think that's important.
My favorite example of this is when we changed licenses from the GPL to Apache. We had 2 people who were really upset about that. 2 people out of thousands of people in the community. And to me, that's a positive community. I expected wars. I expected firebombing. And instead it was, 2 people upset, and then everybody else was like, this seems to make sense. That's fine. We've trained almost 2,500 people in the last couple of years on Puppet, and there's just a huge list of people who are using Puppet all over the world. I was talking to somebody who's going to FOSDEM this week. There's a lot of interesting stuff in Europe and Puppet in the open source community there. So it is a great community. Right, that's number 4. There was a mic over here somewhere.
So I come in from an environment where I do primarily the Linux and Unix stuff, and we have a Windows team. And I was very interested in what you mentioned about the Windows side of things. So they are now looking at implementing something like, I think it's like SCOM or one of the configuration managers. And I was told that it doesn't support the Linux side of things. So I'm just out of luck on that. And I've been doing Puppet for six months now, something around there. So I'm relatively new to this, but it would be interesting if I could sell this to the other people who still don't have anything, because the implementation process for that product is going to take months to years
Yep.
because I work for the state. So I'm just interested in how I could sell that to the Windows people because I've already got something going on the Linux side.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the best ways to sell it is to say, well, you can go spend months on your own on doing this, or hey, why don't we go spend 2 hours in a conference room and we'll show you what we can do, right? Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate reality is that technology can't solve political problems, and so in the end, if it is completely a political problem, it can be very tough to work around, but offer them things for free, right? If you've already got an infrastructure, you've already got the technology, you've already got all that stuff in place, you've already got some code that does things you want, I mean, this works in some places, it doesn't work in others, but if you can get to the point where you can build some core services on Windows box and then show them, look, I was able to do this, and then look at the visibility, right? I mean, I was talking to a customer today, and their goal is to, even if they don't manage Windows, they just want Puppet running on Windows, so they get the facts back, they get some information and some control, kind of for free just by starting the agent in the first place. If you can just get to that point, they can begin to see, oh, well, okay, well, now I've got this vector, and I can do, small things very, very quickly. I'm never a big believer in trying to sell large stories. I like to sell small stories. I like to say, your life can be a little bit better. You can get paged twice, 2 fewer times a day, or, you won't get paged after 6 p.m. anymore. It's kind of these small things that add up very quickly. And I would find a way to, what are the little things they care about that a little bit of success would cause them to go, all right, I'm no longer hostile. Now we can have a conversation. Okay, now you can have a real conversation and have a little bit more success in there. That's what I would start with, but it's a cultural barrier more than anything else, right? And one of the other things too is to figure out, I hate to use let's go to management as an excuse, but in some ways, having a company-wide perspective on the conversation, rather than this is my team and that's your team, and hey, let's work together as teams. Like, what does the company need? Instead of doing this, how can we both look forward and say, what are the company goals, and how can we make sure the technology choices we're making today are aligned with where the company needs to be in 12 months and 24 months? And then also try really hard, which is about the only real answer, unfortunately.
Right here, Arne.
Go ahead.
So this will be an easier question. Do you still
I love
code?
easy questions.
Do you still code Puppet?
Do I still call it?
Do you still code?
Yeah.
Not much. Let's see, the last time I did any actual coding in it was I wrote a prototype in September. It's easy to figure out from my GitHub profile when I last did anything. I don't do much coding. I'm still really actively involved in the product, whether the product managers want it or not. I'm involved in a lot of their planning meetings. They do demos to me almost every week, and I spend a lot of time giving feedback on what the plans are, what the state of the system is. Is this the right prioritization? Is this the right feature? Did we actually like what we've built there? I don't personally do a lot of coding anymore, partially because my patches kept getting rejected for code quality, but some of it's just there's a reason why I hire a bunch of developers, and it's because they're much better at it than I am. And also I'm never going to be. Every CEO is different, right? Some CEOs come up through sales, some come up through marketing. I'm never not going to be a product CEO. I'm never not going to be somebody who spends the majority of his time in product. But for me, now that I understand much better the difference between product management and engineering and user experience, I'm much more of a product and user experience person than I ever was an engineer. I was frankly kind of a crappy engineer. But I'm pretty good at knowing what we should build and why we should build it and what the user experience should feel like and if that's a good user experience. So that's really where I spend a lot more of my time. But even then, it's a lot more of feedback and review than it is direct execution.
As someone who started using on the 2.7 releases, I've been bitten many times by regressions on minor release changes, like in 2.7.3, SSH authorized key resource stopped working if you had spaces in the name, and 2.7.7, like if you directories that had the transverse bit, the execute bit wouldn't get set, and now in Puppet 3.01, if you don't have a Puppet group, the whole thing won't even run. So I kind of have a little bit of concern about QA. You guys run what type of testing process do you run Puppet through before you do a release?
testing is fundamentally hard, and we spend more time and energy testing than on almost anything else. We have a continuous integration system that right now it takes about 24 hours to run through the entire test cycle. I don't know what the numbers are. I think it's something like 30,000 different unit tests and quite a few integration tests. The problem is, I think there are two major problems. One is, literally, testing is fundamentally hard, and until you run into something the first time, until a bug shows up the first time, it's almost impossible. You can't have complete coverage to say, I have discovered all the bugs that could exist, and I will make sure that they are all, tested for. But the more important problem in Puppet is that I was just talking about being a crappy engineer, right? As we built the system, and especially as I built the system in the first place, it wasn't built as modularly as it needed to be, and it ended up with a very large surface area. So if you're going into the system, you're trying to make a change. You need to add functionality, you need to fix a bug, and you're trying to figure out what are the downstream effects of this change? What's going to happen if I make this change? It's too difficult to predict the outcome of a change to the system right now. And so in some ways, the only way to get from here to where we are at a point where we have predictable behavior every time and we have something we can consistently test every time is we have to get to a point where a significant part of the system is kind of made smaller and made more stable and has a smaller surface area so that we can test that surface area, test the individual modules, the individual components, and then kind of test how they interact. But right now, Puppet itself is kind of too big to always test all the time every little thing. And some of that's just from being an 8-year-old project, right? It's been around for a very long time. And some of that also is, you look in the system and you go, is anybody using this part of the system? Can I remove this code? And you do a poll on the user list. Is anybody doing this? If I make this change, is it going to affect anybody? And it looks like, no, nobody's going to be affected by this. And then you actually put it into production, and suddenly there are small fires scattered around the world. And some of that is just basically like, Puppet is so easy to crack open and begin doing weird things with that almost anything, because you can't build a defined API and say this is the part you can talk to and you can't talk to anything else. People are doing weird things almost everywhere, and that just by itself increases the testing load and increases the load of determining the safety of a change so much that that's really affected. If I had to pick one thing that affects our ability to add features or get work done quickly in Puppet, it's that we have to spend so much more time figuring out the effect of any given change that it's fantastically expensive. So we know that's a real problem. We absolutely acknowledge that. Eric Sorensen's the product manager on the open source side, and he really owns Puppet itself. And that's his major stress point this year is how do I make it so that when we make changes to the system, we can do it quickly, but we can do it safely. And a lot of that is making the system smaller, making more defined APIs, and for the APIs, we essentially getting to the point where we say, look, if you're using the AZ APIs, we can make these promises and we can test compliance to these promises. And if you're not using the APIs, we just can't make any promises. It's Ruby, you can do whatever you want, but we're not necessarily going to support you using internal methods, internal APIs in a way that we literally can't predict. We don't know what you're doing. We can't support those things going forward. Obviously, some of the things you mentioned aren't.
Yeah, I wasn't using any. I'm talking about like the file resource. Or
No, I know that. My point though is that like, for the cost of every change is too high right now, which reduces our ability to kind of get everything done at the same time. So we know it's a problem, and I think it's better today than it was a couple of years ago, but it does still need to improve, and we are working at it actively. In our last release of Puppet Enterprise, for instance, we tested Puppet on more than 1,000 nodes at once, and we regularly, we burst out to EC2 and run all of our continuous integration jobs, and we have a ton of testing. It's never enough. Kyle.
Oh, we have one over here.
Okay.
Can you share your moment when you thought of starting the Puppet Labs? Like when you, I heard that, you started from a administration point of view. So your moment when you thought like, okay, this is not way it should go, so I should really start something. So what's the moment that triggered you?
Yeah, it was kind of it was a number of pieces together. One was, so I'd been involved in the Lisa community for a long time, which is the Usenix the Usenix sysadmin conference. It's been going on for 28 years or something like that. They just had it in San Diego in December. And I think they still have a configuration management workshop, and I've been involved in this workshop since 2001. And there were almost everybody in that workshop had written a tool of some kind. There was the author of CF Engine was there, the author of LCFG and SmartFrog and Quator, and there are all these different people who have written their own tools there, bconfig, and there were a lot of conversations about what the right tool was, and obviously they were all wrong, and so I spent a lot of time explaining to them how they were wrong, and then at some point it was like, you know, I should shut up and prove things rather than just talking all the time. And so I wrote some prototypes to kind of see, okay, what would this look like, and see, see what my ideas were. And at the time I was using CF Engine a lot. I was a contributor to CF Engine, and I became a consultant focused on CF Engine. And I got frustrated with CF Engine because I couldn't, the author of CF Engine was primarily concerned about his ability to publish papers. And Mark is a great guy, but he was an academic, and his job was getting published, because that's what academics are supposed to do. And my job was satisfying customers, and we had different concerns. And so I concluded that I couldn't build a consulting company on CF Engine. I was living in Nashville at the time while my wife was getting her PhD, and there weren't really good operations jobs. There wasn't it wasn't like working at Google where you could be a sysadmin and still actually have a great job. Nashville, the options were pretty pitiful. And I'd worked at most of the companies that either I worked there or I knew people who worked there. And I took the LSAT. I thought about going to law school. I was kind of like, I can't work in operations anymore. Apparently, what else can I do? But going to law school is so expensive that you have to become a lawyer afterwards. Didn't want to do that. And a friend of mine, Kent Scar, who now works at VMware, who AOL the AOL operations manager once described as their configuration management solution, he was going to work at BladeLogic as a product manager there. And he somehow convinced them that he wouldn't join unless I went with him, and he convinced me that he wouldn't join unless I went with him. And so I joined him at BladeLogic, and I spent 6 months between September and February living in Watertown, Massachusetts, and commuting by bicycle to Waltham, which is about a 7-mile ride. So it's obviously that's the right time of year to ride your bike in Boston, of course, is February or so. And I lasted about 6 months at BladeLogic, and I realized that they were going to make a lot of money and not make software that I would have been willing to use. And to me, that's a key criteria, right? You walk out and you say, do I think this is good software? Do I think that the people who I know who have this job would be better off with this software? Would they feel like this makes them better at their jobs? And I left because I didn't think the answer was yes. I thought that they were going to be profitable but not build great software. And so I quit, and I didn't really have a plan. When I quit there, I knew I couldn't work there anymore, but I didn't really know what else I could do. And again, I'd already I'd eliminated everything else, right? I'd thought about going to law school. I thought about going to school in general. I thought about getting different kinds of jobs, and I just kind of was like, I guess I really only have one option left. I guess I'll start a company. And I knew, and this is all, I left that in February of 2005. And I knew there was an opportunity because, I mean, seriously, here's a quick poll. This will be fun. All of you who are sysadmins in the room, raise your hand if you have a piece of software you use, that's operation software, sysadmin software that you use that you like a lot. And like, if the answer is Puppet, then don't raise your hand because obviously Puppet's fantastic. But seriously, like, raise your hand. Is there a piece of software that you really like that was built for system administration? What is it? Foreman. Foreman. Okay, so that's one. Anything else? What? Fabric. Okay. IBM Inkscape. Okay. So I was at a table with 8 sysadmins the other day, or not the other day, like 6 months ago, and Scott Johnson in the back was like, come on, there's lots of great system stuff. And everyone in the room goes, no. Operations people, as sysadmins, we tend to suffer through horrible, horrible software. And when I started Puppet Labs was when I concluded that it made sense that there was an opportunity to build software that people didn't hate, that people actually liked, that people felt like, you know what, this makes me better at my job, I enjoy this. And not to say that it's like literally pleasurable to use necessarily, but that, if you have a good tool that you feel like makes you better at your job, then you do enjoy it, and you do, you tend to spend more time at it. And the more I thought about that as the major opportunity, as the major differentiator with what I was going to build, the more it made sense. And so by about the end of February, early March in 2005, I decided, I'd make a go at it. And I figured the worst case was that I would have a product that I could do consulting on that at least I had control of that product. And no one was going to reject my patches if I needed to make a change to it to make it work. So I think that was about it. And I spent 10 months working full-time on that without getting paid at all. And I got my first customer in early 2006. So I was living on my wife's lucrative graduate student stipend while I was doing all that initial development.
A question on orchestration. Today, it seems that Puppet is not really concerning itself with orchestration, so nodes are pretty independent. The best orchestration that I can hope for is, maybe looking up effect in a common database, be it, store configs or Puppet DB. But other than that, even the execution model is pretty asynchronous, right? Puppet agents, wake up from time to time. I don't really control when they do that, although I can, and they do something, right? There seems to be a need for a tighter orchestration in especially distributed systems. So do you consider tighter orchestration as part of the Puppet's charter, or is it something that tools on top of the Puppet are supposed to be doing, like Corrector 8, for example? And if you do consider it part of the Puppet's charter, maybe you can share some of the thoughts on where would you like it to go?
Yeah. It's a great question, and it's a question that a lot of people have right now. For me, it's very clearly part of Puppet Labs' charter. It's part of part of the problems that our customers consistently have, and we need to be good at solving. And to some of that clearly fits into the Puppet's world, and some of that probably fits into other places. There are some things that I've kind of concluded recently that are things we did wrong in Puppet, and you brought up one of them, which is that Puppet tends to, the default use of Puppet is you push code, and at some point, somewhen, your machines wake up and pull down that code. And that isn't actually what most people want. What most people want is, I want to push a button and have the code deploy to all the machines at the right schedule and in the right order from there. And one of the things we've actually been working hard in Puppet on in the last couple of years is getting the Puppet core to the point where we can do that. So as an example, in 3, one of the things we changed was the server can now control the environment instead of the client controlling the environment. So that gives you control at the server side to control how deployment happens and how deployment happens. And there are a number of other changes that give us the power to say, let's control what hosts we run and how we run them from the server side. And that allows you to kind of build a better system that is, okay, here's a list of hosts, let's run them in this order. There have always been tools like mcollective, and you can use Rundeck, and you can use Capistrano to do the triggering. And I was talking to a customer this week who's using Rundeck and Salt and Puppet in combination, where Rundeck is doing the orchestration, and Salt is doing the alerting, and Puppet is still doing the actual work. Electric Cloud is another one that a lot of people are using. But for me, in the long term, I'm pretty addicted to the graph, in case you haven't figured that out. And so for me, what we need to build is a system that allows you to build the same kind of graph you have on the individual host, build that for the wider infrastructure. So when you say, go deploy this change, you want to make sure that you deploy to the databases first, and then the web servers, because that's the dependency stuff. That's something we are working on right now, but it's much more like we're trying to figure out the right approach. I've posted multiple ideas, multiple prototypes. The prototype that I wrote in September was exactly in this area. And I think the prototype I wrote was actually very, very close to what we're going to build in the end, at least in the user experience, not necessarily the implementation. Let me rephrase that. Not at all in the implementation. But the basic idea of how it's going to work, I think, is pretty close to what I built back then. The Reactor 8 team has a very good example of how to do this too. But my goal is to add as little as possible to the system and have it overall look as much as possible like, retain the same semantics as we already have. A resource should still mean the same thing. A graph should still be there. An edge should still be there. It should be idempotent. Resources should be unique across the infrastructure, things like that. So, you're going to see some movement on that this year, and I hope you're going to see some in the first couple quarters. Last question.
Yeah, you mentioned that release management was a major goal for 2013, right? So can you elaborate a little bit more? I mean, are you planning on releasing some new products, or are you planning on doing some integration with build systems? I'm just trying to get some more details on what you mean by release management.
Let's talk about semantics. No, let's not talk about semantics. Yeah, so I'm going to do my best to not answer your question. And the reason for that is that it's very, very easy to argue about what release management means, and I don't want to argue that if I can possibly avoid it. The best way I have of describing it is I want to build tools and technology that make it easier to get code from the developer's keyboard or the vendor's website into production. I want to give you control and visibility at every stage of the process, and I am primarily concerned with giving the human control, not building automated anything, which I know sounds counterintuitive to an automation company, but I think that step one is essentially understanding when updates are available. Give you the visibility to say, here's what's happening, and have that visibility be in the form of change. So one of the things that we realized maybe a year or so ago was Puppet in some ways talks about change the wrong way. We talk about a steady state, and then here's a change that happened to that, and the reality is that change is constant. And so what you want to be able to do is look more at the change that's happening and less at, here's a steady state and then a change, and here's a steady state. So what we're trying to do is build tools that are more about making the change itself visible, more about making the status and progression of change in your infrastructure visible. And that's kind of the closest I can get to what we're going to build. In the near term, it's about visibility. So we're going to, the product we're working on right now is closest to the visualization of change. But after that, it's going to be about essentially flow control. You've got code ready to deploy. You've got a bunch of machines that are available to accept that code. What steps do you go through? Because what you don't want to do is take code, put in production on all 1,000 machines at once. That's not safe. So there's some process you want to go through. We want to build tools that enable and simplify that process and give you the control without putting you into a bunch of boxes. There's also the process from the actual keyboard into the repository, ready to be deployed in production. That's another aspect that we're going to be working on at some point. Some of those are going to happen this year. Some of those probably are going to take some time.